So these last 2 weeks then we're going to be talking about change management, or the management of implementation, the management of technological implementation. And so this week you read the Jeff Walsham chapter on implementation, and we probably, just judging by the emails, most of the emails were in reference to Chris Gray's piece, the effective change. So we probably end up spending most of this week talking about Chris's piece, and then we can pick up some of the themes in Jeff's piece with the readings for next week as well. So again, the idea here this week, very much like we did with systems development, is that first of all we need to get a sense of why change is difficult, and what are the problems around where we think and talk about change in relation to technology, and the kinds of things that we need to be sensitive to, the kinds of things we need to be attentive to. And then next week, next week we'll focus on different approaches to managing those, different kinds of things you can do as a manager. But again, the first thing to get a sense of is, because it's always important, before you think about how you orientate yourself to something as a manager, is to have a better appreciation for the kind of problem you're dealing with. So in some sense then I think this is what these readings were about this week. How did you find them? How did it go for you? Yeah, Darren, interesting?
Yeah, interesting. I suppose some parts of kind of change management is things that you would think of in your head, but when it's kind of explained to you, you find it interesting. So actually away from the great piece in the Watching chapter, we talked about how some people want to be seen to be supportive of change, but when it actually comes to implementation, they won't be involved at all.
Yeah.
So that was something that when I read it, I was like, oh, that makes complete sense, but I wouldn't have thought about it. It just kind of stood out to me like that.
Okay.
That was interesting.
Yeah. So you preferred the Watching chapter? Is that
yeah. I like the book, but I mean, probably the standout thing that I remember from both readings was that when they were watching references US senators, so that gave me a good reference point where almost to satisfy their constituency or whatever, they'll say X, Y, and Z just to keep everybody happy, but when it comes to actually implementing something, they won't be active at all.
Yeah, so that gap between policy or strategy and implementation, kind of the ambiguity, the necessary ambiguity in that gap. Okay. Any other thoughts?
I like the move to Watching to giving you things to discuss and debate rather than restrictive and moving away from this idea of the list or the process.
Yeah. So you've probably read enough plenty of tracts on change management in the past.
And you know it is. You know, it's very between last week and the tyranny of the process. And it was a break away from it. So, it's every situation is different. It's a recognition.
Okay. So they're not offering a kind of a cookbook approach. Then. They're not offering the kind of thing, top management support, educate the users, training, that sort of.
But it's holistic as well.
What do you mean by holistic?
It's about changing the whole organisation, but specifically change. And it's not just about the one change initiative. It's about this is part of the whole thing. And if you want to be agile, change is a hugely important part of it.
Okay.
And being able to change.
Okay.
The setting, the correlations.
Okay. So how do you reconcile that then with Chris Gray's view on change and change management? How did you find the Gray paper? Difficult, yeah.
The language in it was something that I haven't been used to before, so there's a good, I had the dictionary beside me and looking at the good because I wasn't accustomed to it. But then it took a good few reads to kind of get down to what I was trying to conceptualize. What I was trying to do underneath. And Peter was just saying it earlier and finally caught on with me. It was about the ethical approach to change.
Right. Okay.
And that just made me see that once you have the context of what you're supposed to, I know this topic is organizational change, but once you get down to the ethical approach to it, it kind of puts the paper in a different light compared to what I've been thinking of.
Okay. No,
I found the paper quite tough on social change. like it wasn't, as Ian said, it wasn't hard to tell that Ray has written novels and stuff, but as they had in the first year. You remember Chris Gray's book, Chris is small and short one?
Oh, the small, not very interesting.
Oh, yeah. You were in first year for that, so?
Yeah.
We had in the back of our comic study 50 Shades of Chris Gray. And, yeah, like as Ian said, I have to agree with him. I find it quite hard to understand and brought in so many different points and points of view to change, so it was hard to kind of consolidate them all together. And I really didn't enjoy the reading. Very tedious and tough, to be honest.
Yeah, it's a tough read, so it's not an easy read. There's a lot of, you know, he covers a lot of ground in a small number of pages, and but I want to spend some time talking about it because I think there's some important stuff in there that we need to maybe try and tease out a little bit more. But anyway, did anyone like that paper specifically?
Yeah, I agree. Sorry.
Yeah.
I actually absolutely, I really liked that paper. I thought that was one of the best papers I've read so far.
Great.
In terms of like, it really just changed my whole point of view in terms of this class. Well, not in terms of class, but it just kind of made me question everything I've read so far, and it just kind of made me feel again like, you know, I really don't have a clue what I'm talking about here. In a good way.
No, and actually that's really important, you know, that kind of modest orientation is really important as a manager as well, you know, in terms of rather than kind of deluding yourself that this is, you know, that everything is completely under control here and all these plates are going to continue to spin. So yeah, okay. And was there any particular aspect of it that you found most interesting, or what I mean, so overall it was just kind of in the sense that it was challenging stuff that you'd kind of taken for granted of it?
Yeah, so it kind of, I suppose, obviously in our questions we saw about the metaphors, so that was one area that really, just because in this class we kind of introduced the metaphors, and then he made me actually think, I kind of had a very superficial view on metaphors and organizations. I just kind of took your word and took what I was reading, as this is the best way, and I didn't think about the underlying assumptions that come with these metaphors and what these actually mean in a real world organization. And this might be due to my lack of real world experience, but it kind of made me question that bit as well.
Okay, good. And Andrea?
I thought it was very nice. It's just sometimes you get presented with facts and you have a certain feeling but you are not really able to argue against them so much. And I think with this kind of changing environment, it's a bit the same. So just have a sense, but it's hard to argue against it, and he really managed to make very good points there about the two questions, his assumptions there. So.
Okay. So I won't steal your thunder for the presentation. I'll give you a chance to say that. You'll have more time to say something. Any other thoughts on the great paper? Yeah?
A bit too critical and less substantiating, so
okay.
have to relate to what he is.
Yeah. So it's very critical, isn't it? It's very, very critical. Yeah, very critical. And okay, and so you felt that some of the points he was making that he wasn't convincing on them in some sense. Okay, great. Okay, so and what we'll do is we'll try and identify what these points are, and then we'll try and draw these out a little bit in the conversation as we go on. Yeah. Any other thoughts on it?
Is it more of a paper, like Andrew said, that you need experience to truly understand what it's from? What aspects is it coming from, rather than just some of us are coming straight from college and some of us are from industry. So you look at it from different approaches.
My view as well with most management stuff, most good management stuff, the more management experience you have, the more you can take from it, you know, and because in some sense you have to live some of these things in these organizations in order to kind of to know exactly what he's saying in a particular point or something like that. So I think that's always the struggle. That's always the struggle when you're management education. If you haven't substantially, I mean, most of you have experience, you know, even if it's part-time jobs and stuff like that, working in some kind of organisation. So, or even just part of local community organisations or sports organisations or religious organisations, whatever. So all of us have been kind of deeply embedded in organisations for a lot of our lives, but still there's something about the kind of the corporate environment too. I think that's a bit different. Actually, just reminded me of the conversation because you brought it up last week, Niall, on the moving out and moving into the big job, the big corporate and stuff like that. Lucy Kellaway has a nice piece in the Financial Times today about millennials and kinds of expectations. And so if you've got free access to Financial Times right through college. So I just had a quick read this morning. It's a nice she writes well and she writes in a funny kind of way, but it kind of reminded me of the conversation we had in class last week a little bit, so that's worth taking that. Okay, any further points before we see how the presenters found the papers? Since you're a bit tired, Ian. Struggling with it, it's late in the term, alright? Okay, so anyway, let's get on with the presentation then, and we'll take up the conversation from there. Okay, so you probably need to open them and see.
We look at a critique of the original.
Oh yes, so I've got a bunch of critiques here, yeah. So I think I've got it in some. Great, yeah. No, there you go.
Yeah, hi there. So today our topic is IS implementation and organizational change. And we had 2 readings about it. So this is one from chapter 10 about organizational issues of IS implementation, which we distinguish from the just technical view on IS implementation. And well, maybe important to say about the water chapter, we found is that so there are 2 kind of types of organizational implementation of IS. One is one which just reinforces or represents organization as it is, and one is which leads to or is connected to organizational change. And I think the second type is the one we mostly talks about as well, and which connects well to the Gray paper. So, as we heard already, Gray kind of unpacks very many taken for granted assumptions on change management. Does it in a very convincing way. And, well, maybe the main assumption he unpacks is that organizations, it is told to us that organizations live in a kind of very fast, rapid changing environment. And so, as a consequence, they need to adapt to this environment in order to be able to survive. Well, what Gray analyzes this in this way, saying that actually this is based on this organismic metaphor of organizations being very strongly distincted in system and environment. And with this kind of, it works like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So organizations believe that they need to adapt to these changes by changing. So by changing, they then create the ever faster changing environment themselves. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And now I will pass to Maha to tell us about technology and organizational change, and then I speak with resistance to change.
Hi everyone. If we look about Richard's chapter, he makes 2 points about IS implementation and organizational change, which are political and culture. Marcus and FIFA argue that different political strategy and tactics are needed in order to achieve effective implementation. Because they posted out 2 points about that. The first one, if the goal, if implementers, is to minimize resistance and maximize system success, that's mean the system can be designed. The system can design to be consist with organizational power, distribution, and culture. The second point, if the goal is to effect a significant organizational change, the issues of restraints and organizational implementation need to be addressed. After that, Marcus and FIFA focus more between culture and the need of cultural change in order to address the issues of organizational implementation. because the new social structure need a high level of success implementation and organizational change, and that can be happen with control of between the two things, power distribution and culture, and the structural feature of organization. After that, Gray he suggests some reasons for a change and change in management. The first one, we live in times of change, and that's found in many ages, or perhaps every age. And the second point, the past seems more stable than the present, because it is the past, because it helps us to build our experience. I have my own example in my own experience. We have quarterly target. When they start the first month in the target, when they end the first month in the target, no one can complete or close this target. But when we start this in the second month, we can close the second month, and we completely close the gap for the first month. And sometimes we can close it the third month in the target. That means our experience in the past help us how can control this change. And Andrea can.
Then we want to talk a little bit about resistance to change. Was it first as Gray puts it, and then as Watson puts it. So Gray is pointing towards change management literature. So change management literature is assuming that resistance to change is one of the major explanation for change management failure or for difficulties in change management. So, and it's assumed that resistance to change is kind of a natural human psychological condition. Gray gives this example of the carnal, cycle or steps, how naturally resistance to change is there, and then how we overcome it. Well, Gray is not saying that it is not the case at all that in some situations the reason why we resist to change might just simply be because you will resist to change. He's saying that might actually be the case in some points, but it is very problematic if it's the only causal explanation we present. So, because people which resist change might get stigmatized as individuals in the states where they need help, and we don't look at the situation as such anymore. So we look at the individuals as a problem. And Gray argues instead that this is quite possible that people just resist to change for two other reasons, and I think it's very convincing here. So he says that people might just resist because effects of change might just simply be negative for them. So he gives the example of privatization of state-run companies, which are often tied to pay cuts or firing of staff. This is clearly a negative effect of change. And the opposite example would be if you would offer people a pay rise or more holiday, you wouldn't find much resistance. So I think this is a very convincing point. And then he also said, and I think this links very well back to the seminar we had last week, and it actually also links to this model here. So what we see here is actually that if we buy into this a little, that when change occurs, so there's a whole process of internalization going on. So as we talked the last time about the complexity of working practices, how we embody working practices and that we are actually not even aware of them anymore. So there's a very maybe lots of effort and lots of time going into this embodiment. So then when change actually happens, there's quite a bit of effort involved in that. So and as we said before, change management often also fails, and maybe also because of this, because its complexity is underestimated. So then people might just resist to change because they are aware of the fact that change management can fail. Yeah. Oh. And then just to Walsham. So now I come to Walsham. He just talks about resistance to change only with regarding the role of the IS implementer mostly. And I thought he's a bit more ambiguous about resistance to change. So on the one hand, he says that the role of the IS implementer should be to engage with these political tactics, face-to-face contact, and you should have ideological training. You need to kind of convince people about the merits of the system. So kind of resistance to change is seen as something which needs to be overcome. On the other hand, he talks about the moral dilemma of IS implementers, so that actually they should not use their kind of skills for dubious purposes. So that actually you should have a look at what kind of changes you buy into, you kind of try to sell to the people. So yeah, and then he's taking this a bit further with regard to the learning process. So he says that resistance to change can be seen then as something, as a sign that we need to engage in a debate and in mutual learning. I think we discussed that with regard to the Curtis, Klassen and ISCO paper. So that it can be seen as a sign to get different perspectives on board and engage with mutual learning. Okay, and now we conclude.
We conclude our presentation. We found implementation and organizational change is very complex, and both part of the papers also very complex. And we are strongly agree a change can be with the gray because change can be imposed following certain rules and a common assumption what work in one area will be work in a different context.
Yeah, then those papers suggest, well, water maybe less than gray, but that there's a moral issue as well going on. So we need to ask what kind of changes are we talking about? So what are they affecting with regard to working practices, and who are they affecting as well? And this should be, maybe as Watchman suggests, can be part of an open debate and about the learning process. And then we thought as well, so with regard to what we discussed before, the concept of technologies in use. So if we look at these papers, but step away maybe a little bit of that. So actually with regard to change, we actually don't know how changes might unfold. So we will end up with, as we said, multiple technologies in use with multiple interpretations of how to use this technology, and like unintended consequences. And just at last we kind of critiqued both papers, or tried to critique both papers a little bit. So what Washington gets, maybe he addresses multiple practitioners, I'd say, and he gives them attention to the social context of IS implementation versus the technical features, which is, I think, very important. Well, we thought that he buys a bit too much after you read Ray, so we think he buys a bit too much into this change management literature and just treats these moral ethical aspects as a side aspect and keeps a bit ambivalent over them. So, and then he also, I think, has a bit of a narrow definition of the social context, only with regard to leadership and responsibility. In the Gray paper, we could see that he talks about this post-industrial business milieu and what kind of subjectivities this produces, and I think this could, for example, be taken as a social context as well, which is a bit wider. And then Gray clearly gives us a bigger picture, so it's kind of this unpacking of the taking for granted assumptions is helping us to rethink about what kind of values and consequences change management strategies include, so to make up our minds with that regard. But then maybe a bit next maybe said as well. So on one hand, then he's suggesting to demolish the change management discourse, but as he said before, the change is actually a human condition, so we clearly find it in organizational life as well going on. So if change is a natural human condition, then should we not think about it with regard to organizational life, and then maybe just think about it in a different way? Okay, many thanks. And
okay, any questions or comments?
Did you buy into Gray's argument? I mean, you said it's contradictory.
I completely think he has a point there when I haven't read myself very many change management literature, but I think he sounds very convincing about, and you often use those arguments in other contexts as well. So I think he's very good at unpacking these, but he doesn't leave you with very much. So when you want to, I don't know, when you want to get some advice or some kind of ideas about how to approach change management, I think in some or the other way change management takes place, if we want or not. So it must not be about creating changes that are not, that we do not wish for. That's probably the thing he points to most clearly, but changes take place, and sometimes changes can be good as well. So we might even think changes, so and then we need to think about how to manage or how to organize them. So, yeah.
Tell me a little bit about your experience of reading these papers. I mean, what did it feel like reading these papers over the last week? What phases did you go through reading these papers?
Okay. Yeah, well, I had my difficulties with water paper, maybe because I'm not coming from a software development background, so I found them very dry, and I didn't always understand why he comes up with all these aspects, and I thought they don't really have a clear message. Yeah. So I wasn't sure what he was trying to tell. I think he was having this analytical dimension, and he's applying them to different subjects. Yeah, and so he's kind of opening things up as well. So try to approach debate and going away from so many technical features, but yeah, I had a bit of difficulties with that one. But I really liked the grade paper. I found it very encouraging to maybe think critically about taking for granted assumptions like change management, but I think you can apply it to many other fields as well. As a PhD student, especially because you read loads of things and then you always think, yeah, this is a very good article, this is a very good article, but so maybe to encourage yourself to question the assumptions a bit more. So yeah.
And grades more related to our experience, and when I found what two chapters it's difficult, and what example use is very difficult for me.
Okay.
But grades very simple for me.
Okay. So you found it easier to read grades
Yeah.
than the word.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Great. So let me throw that question out to the class in general. This question about, let's start with grade, because we get to Walsham, but grade was the one that raised most of the questions in your email questions this week. So I want to spend some time talking about grade, because I have a sense from some of the questions that you took different things from grade. And I think it's very important for us to be clear about what we think Gray is saying here, and what, and just in terms of, just to give a sense, now you already said, now that Phoebe, you said that you didn't particularly like Gray's reading, you found it difficult to comprehend at some levels. And you felt that what Gray seems to miss is the decreasing life cycle of digital products and technologies, and that this presents an unprecedented amount of change on a regular and continual basis, and so consequently we need change management programs. Okay, and Rupali and Darren, you said that Gray completely shows the idea of change by providing some very convincing arguments. What you want to counter-argue is that the sheer complexity of organizational change that extends beyond the simple. So you're saying that it's more. So you're saying, are you saying that Gray's analysis isn't complex enough, or?
I think that one of the things that jumped out at me just regarding that is he says it's quite difficult to measure change success, particularly in larger organizations, because there could be potentially a lot of change programs happening at the one time. And he kind of gets a little bit philosophical when he says that it's impossible to know what would have happened had a change management thing been implemented or not implemented. So in that regard, I found it hard to kind of see if he was, to see if he was kind of going that change management could be successful or not.
Okay.
I found that a little bit tricky to get my head around.
Okay, so let's try and address some of those ones. First of all, let's think about the grey article particularly, okay? What were you feeling when you read this? Let's forget about what you're thinking now. Try and think about what were you feeling when you read this.
I thought he was deconstructing the old.
Okay, yeah. But how did that make you feel? Were you happy about that? Were you sad about that?
In the context of what we've been talking about, we have talked about this deterministic approach, how we can't predict the future. So he was going after all the wrong things.
Okay.
And he was drawing it from management science and that actually spread it wider into social science.
Yeah.
Saying power, you can't, this is an illusion. There's an illusion of power that you can drive these things.
Yeah. Okay.
And I thought it was really constructed.
Okay.
That's his purpose.
Okay. Right. Okay. So any other feelings? What was the major feeling? Can you think about a major feeling? Because one of the things that I get sometimes when I use this in exec ed context is they're very quick to describe the feeling they have oftentimes. When will it ever end? Okay, boredom. Okay, that's one.
I think it was the breadth. Normally when we look at an argument, it was the breadth of the argument. I thought he was mowing down the whole area.
Okay, so it was big scope. The feeling people often describe that I've had in other classes, in terms of, particularly in executive classes, reading this is one of anger. People feeling angry about this, what the hell is Gray doing? Gray is some kind of smart aleck here who's making all these kind of provocative arguments. Did anyone feel anger reading the Gray piece?
I don't know about anger, but definitely that feeling, what's Gray doing here? It kind of feels like there's literature about organizational change and the fact ways of implementing change programs and everything else. But Gray is the term man who, in my experience of Gray, writes novels, not academic literature, and he turns around and just has a complete reductionist view of change. And he doesn't necessarily say it's pointless, but he kind of he's very reductionist of it. I just really agree with some points.
What do you mean by reductionist?
It's just kind of, I don't know if reductionist is the right word for amusing, but like he was very dismissive.
He was very dismissive, definitely. Very dismissive.
It's like he took many arguments and just wrote them down and said, like, I remember as the girls said in their presentation, like the past always seems more stable than the present. That was one thing. And then there was one point that I did agree with him, that what's to say that people of the past didn't experience the same level of change that we're experiencing now. I mean, who would to say that we did? I did agree with that. But there was other points I just thought, shut up, Ray, you're just throwing a spanner in the works.
I mean, that does tie into fashion, this idea that we have to change for change's sake.
And self-fulfilling prophecy.
I think it's good to change it.
Okay. So the first thing I think the first point we're coming to anyway, as you say, is that Gray's deliberately trying to provoke. Okay. So he wants the project. He's kind of, and he wants. What he's trying to do, he's trying to write in a way to get a reaction. Okay. So this isn't the kind of dry academic piece. I think this is done. He uses colourful language. The book actually, which you two guys have already some experience with, I would highly recommend that book. I mean, it's basically a rant about the state of organisation theory, and it's done in a kind of in a humorous way, and it's done in a very critical kind of a way as well. But there's a lot of kind of self-knowledge in his humour. I mean, he's got one section entitled something like so what are you cribbing about now? And so he sees himself as this kind of almost angry man in pub giving out about organisation theory and about how we think about organisations and so the book is called what is it? A fairly short, cheap.
Reasonably interesting book.
Reasonably interesting book about studying organisation, I think. and I think it's now in its at least its third edition, maybe. But it's you know, it's, I think it's kind of it's bedtime reading. Okay, it's kind of it's light, it's provocative. So a key feature of this article, then again, and you always need to think about the style of the article that you're reading. A key feature here: he wants to provoke you. He wants to draw you out. He wants to start an argument with you. Okay, and the other piece about it here, as well as you said in terms of the broad scope, it's a piece of polemic. This is a polemical piece. Okay, he doesn't want to go for a nice balanced view or anything. He wants to make a strong argument. And why do you feel he finds it necessary to use the device of polemic here? You understand what a polemic is? Polemic is where you take one pole of the argument and you really go at that. So he decides to take a side and really push that side and really make that case for that particular side.
Somebody then has to manipulate the case with the others.
Yeah. But genuinely, I mean, Chris is angry about this stuff. He is angry about this stuff. He is angry about the way we think and talk about organisations. He is angry about the stuff that's taught in business schools. He's a business school professor himself, but he is angry about the mainstream, how the mainstream stuff is taught, and what people are taught, and what kind of ideas they're presented with, and so on. And he feels that that there's so much rubbish written about change that he needs to readdress that in a way that grabs your attention. Okay, so he's doing a brave thing here. He's coming out and he's taking what is, a sacred cow, basically, in management, and he's having a pop at it and I think in a very successful way as well in many respects. So the key thing we have to figure out then, though, I think, is because the other thing I got from the questions is I think perhaps there's certainly a difference in terms of what you feel Gray's argument is. Some of you are taking different things from it, and I think there's a sense in which some of you are misinterpreting, I think, the points he's trying to make. So the first thing about this is what's Gray's target here? What's his target? What's he against? So some of you said in your questions, Gray seems to be against change. Gray seems to be a change denier. The change doesn't happen. And is that right?
We sort of took it as against management design.
Okay, yeah.
It's deterministic.
Yeah.
So it's not. So he does question the whole discourse. But he said, look.
Yeah.
If you want to go about it,
Okay.
this is a ridiculous way to do it.
So a key thing to understand when you're reading this paper, I think, to really bear in mind here, is that Chris Gray is not change denier. Chris Gray isn't saying, change doesn't happen in organisations and that one has to be ready for change and that one has to be adjusted to change and all that sort of thing. He's not saying that at all. He's not denying this at all. His target is not change. His target is the discourse of change management. And again, if we use discourse in the Foucauldian kind of sense here, because Chris draws on Foucault quite a lot in terms of writing this piece. So he references Foucault, but a lot of the ideas, Foucault's behind him. So again, there's a kind of so by Foucauldian discourse, I mean a kind of sense in which the way we talk about change, the way we think about change, the way we enact change management. So what we have developed over the last, and only really since the 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s, there was three concepts that became really important in management thought around that time. And the three of them are completely intertwined with one another. One is the notion of leadership. Suddenly now organizations need leaders, not managers. The other was culture, organizational culture, and culture change. And the third one is change management. And so we have three ideas which are incredibly central. If you look at the kind of the popular management books that you find on the shelf in an airport bookstore, the kind of what we typically talk about, airport management books, which is typically to be found right next to the fiction section. Those kinds of books, if you look at them, take out the ones that aren't concerned with leadership, that aren't concerned with culture change, or aren't concerned with change management, and you'll be left with very few. Okay? And you might throw technology in there as well as another good one in there. And so this is something that has been an obsession in management thought since the 1970s. And one of the questions again is, why has this arose? Why? So what Chris is saying here is that we have that within the business world today, and within business schools, we have particular ways of thinking about change management, of talking about change management, and in organisations of enacting these kinds of change management programs. And this is his target. He says that change has become a fetish. Change has become a fetish. Okay, what do we mean by a fetish? What does the word fetish mean? What does he mean to say? Because this is the title of the paper. Change has become fetishized. What does it mean to fetishize something?
Rituals, when we believe it happens, we follow that without any rational thinking.
Okay, I think that captures a lot of it. In some sense, you kind of lose your sense of your rational senses.
There's also maybe an element of perversion that is.
Yeah. So it's an obsession, but it's kind of an unhealthy obsession. It's kind of an unhealthy obsession. So basically, what he's saying here is that we've developed this very unhealthy obsession with change. And he says that, and so what he wants to do here is he wants to point out the flaws and the inconsistencies in the way we think and talk about change and its management in organisations. And in some sense, Chris isn't a kind of a lone voice in the desert here. There are other people as well who would make similar kinds of arguments in different ways. There was a really nice piece in the New Yorker a few years back by a woman who writes for the New Yorker quite a lot, Jill Lepore. And you'll be reading that, some of you, if you're doing the summer module. It's called What the Theory of Disruptive Innovation Gets Wrong.
We did it with Duncan last
Lepore article as well? No, just Jill Lepore,
Christians in this.
Yeah. So she's making kind of similar arguments here about this whole the grip of the change. So in some sense, the change industry. There's something here about a change industry here at play, and people like Henry Mensberg as well. We talked about Mensberg before. You've had a Mensberg paper to write about. So Mensberg would be very critical of a lot of this stuff as well, about this obsession with leadership, this obsession with change, or a particular conception of leadership. This kind of notion of a kind of a heroic leadership, which Chris Gray is very critical of here as well. And so what he wants to do then is, in some sense, he wants to point out the flaws, the inconsistencies, and the paradoxes about the way we think and talk about change in organisations. And he said, look, this is based on a lot of problematic assumptions. And then, so he says that there's three kind of key elements to his critique here. First of all, he wants to critique this major assumption that we somehow today are living in times of unprecedented change. That today is the fastest moving kind of hyper speedy society that has ever been. And so he says that this is a really important assumption because a lot of other stuff then is built on top of this assumption. And the second bit then he wants to attack, his second point of attack, are the kind of the dominant understandings of organisational change, or the popular conceptions of organisational change. And the third part he wants to attack then is the popular explanations for why change management typically fails. So there's three parts to his argument here, and I want to go through them one by one actually, because I think they're all important. I'll just go through them briefly. I know you've read the paper, so I just want to try and draw out some of what I see as some of the key points here and see how you feel about these kinds of points. And then let's see how you feel about this article once we've had a chance to talk it through. And the kinds of and think about the kinds of things that was bugging you about this paper and the kinds of things you didn't like about this paper. And stop me as we go through this, and let's debate these issues, and let's have a discussion about these issues, because Chris is putting a point here, is making a point here, and this point is possible to disagree with this point as well. Yeah?
Just on what you're saying there. Is it not a point of why his paper is so vast is because organizational change isn't a specific thing?
Yeah.
It takes in so many things
Yeah.
as they go on such a wide scope.
Yeah.
Organizational change is like.
Yeah, and it's a big industry. You know, it's a big industry and it's a powerful industry. And if you think about it as an industry, I think it's one way, you know, the industry around organizational change. Okay, and we'll come to that, we'll come back to that in a moment. But think about it first of all as this notion of the discourse of change, the way we think about change, the way we talk about change, the way we enact change in organizations. He said, look, there's some really problematic stuff going on here. We have to be very careful about that. And he says, okay, well, first of all, this notion that we're living in this kind of era of unprecedented change. So what he says is that basically there's an argument out there that the world we're living in today, that this is that we're living in, you know, unprecedented times. You know, that somehow the world today has gone crazy, and that this craziness has been driven by information technology, number one, computer systems, the internet, but also globalization. So the dual effect, so typically the way the argument goes, the dual effect of information communication technologies and globalization has made the world an incredibly fast-paced, unstable place. It's produced this crazy world that poses huge challenges to the stability of organizations, but we must embrace this change if we want to thrive in the kind of modern context. And the way to do this, the way to survive in this crazy world, is to embrace the change management discourse, to embrace the principles of change management. So in other words, what they're doing is saying, the world has gone mad, but here we have change management is the way to survive in this crazy world. Okay? So, let's take this first issue first, and this is his first kind of point of attack here. So his first point of attack here is about the notion that the rate of change in the world today is unprecedented. We have never lived in a more fast-changing world than we have today. And, you know, he makes points, he draws in the articles, you know, about all the change management books and the kind of popular management books and the kind of airport management books that all start off with, we're living today in times of unparalleled change and stuff like that. And certainly if I had €1 for every time I graded an undergraduate essay with those kinds of opening lines, I'd be a very wealthy man. You know, this is one of the kind of the foundational commandments of modern organizational life. That the world has gone crazy. We're living in a world which is completely unlike anything that was before, and it's changing so fast that the struggle is to survive, is to keep surviving in this kind of crazy world. But he says, okay, well, actually, if you think about this, that's a kind of a problematic contention. The notion that the world today is changing at an unprecedented rate. Why? What's his argument, first of all, and then let's try and evaluate it. And you're going to have to make up your own minds a lot of these arguments yourself, in terms of where you're
I think he's saying two things. One is that if you look back, times have always been changing. For example, when the printing press came up, and so there have been loads of kind of revolutions where things started to change for people. And then the second thing is that our perception always is that the past was very stable, and so every generation feels that we're in very changing, dynamic times.
So this notion of exceptionalism, that this is an exceptional time to be alive, that this is an exceptional generation. He said this is the conceit. This is a conceit that every generation has. Every generation thinks that they're living in a much more exciting times, or much more interesting times, or much more vibrant times, and he said that if you look back in history, nearly every generation, and certainly in recent times, in modern history, would have thought this. And he said there's good reasons. There's good reasons for this. This is the first good reason is that the past always seems more stable than the present. The past always seems more stable than the present. Why? Why does the past always seem more stable than the present?
Because it's happened.
because it's happened. We know how it's panned out. We know what the outcome is like, you know. And so, if you look back at some historical film, I mean, I'm just thinking there now. Actually, I was just rewatching Band of Brothers. Some of you may have watched Band of Brothers. So it's Steven Spielberg's take on the kind of the post-Normandy invasion, the American forces' involvement in that and push into Europe, and so I was rewatching that with my 12-year-old son, who's a complete kind of military history buff, and just to see the kinds of lives and the kinds of changes that were made to these people's lives, people who lived through that World War era, people who were affected by that. Chris Gray talks about his own father and ending up, you know, farming in Canada and fighting in Korea. He talks about his wife, Natalie Meathead, who's an IS academic actually. Natalie's dad had to escape from Bulgaria and ended up in France, you know, with, you know, no money, barely any clothes, not able to speak the language. And he's saying, and so our world is crazy. Our world, you know, the changes in our lives are spectacular. You know, that we just look back in the past. You know, if you watch anything or if you read anything about, say, for instance, the Cuban Missile Crisis and stuff like that, where, you know, there was a real sense that if someone presses the button, the world might be gone tomorrow. And and we're saying that the world is crazy today because we got the internet and we got mobile phones. And so he says that we always experience the past in a kind of a sanitized form. You know, we always experience it in a kind of a sanitized form because we know what the outcomes are going to be, and it's kind of a rationalized form. And so we assume that, oh, everything was nice and stable, and then the internet came along, and then everything went bloody crazy. You know, and think about it. You know, think about it. And he said, but he says, we have no basis even for sustaining or evaluating these changes. So he says, you know, change, you know, the rate of change unprecedented for whom? You know, and which was more significant? You know, the printing press or the microchip? Along which dimensions should we evaluate this kind of change, or the significance of this kind of change, or for whom? So, and you know, Dunica a few years ago actually wrote into a paper where he did a kind of an analysis, I think, of patent data from the US. So patent data as a kind of a very as a kind of an indicator of innovative technological innovation and innovative activity around technology and so on. As people are making more patents, there's more technology to produce and so on. And he did an analysis, I think, from when records began in terms of the patent offices in the US up until now, in present times. And when do you think that he find was the time that seemed to be the most significant in terms of technological innovation? So he started, I think, in the late 19th century up until the kind of the present day, early 21st century. When was the peak of innovation activity? Trying to guess. Mid-90s?
When it kind of went.
Yeah, no, apparently, no.
Well, there's other with the telephone, electric.
Yeah. As far as I remember now, it was kind of 1920s. So you know, think about the number of technologies which have significantly changed our lives. Many of which we just see as just so banal and so ordinary. And so, I mean, think about, for instance, telephone dimension, or the telegraph. So there's this wonderful book that I used to use in the early days of the internet when I was teaching courses on electronic commerce and stuff like that. A book called The Victorian Internet by a guy called Standage, I forget his first name. And it's a nice book because it starts off, the opening paragraph, the opening page is this description of this wonderful technology which is changing the world, which is killing time and space, where there's all sorts of things this network which is embracing the world, where people are developing romances over it, where people are ripping each other off over it, where it's completely obliterating space. And he writes about all these wonderful things that are happening around this new network. And you ask the students, okay, well, what are they talking about here? Obviously, it's the internet. It was the telegraph. The telegraph. You know? So this was taken from a newspaper. This was taken from a contemporary newspaper, I think the New York Times, an article back in the early days of the telegraph describing this thing. And it's just amazing. You could have taken that whole article and just changed the word internet to telegraph, and the same stuff been written, and the same breathless kind of optimism about how this is just changing everywhere, a mixture of optimism and fear usually in these articles. The same thing. And so when you look at these things historically, and so look at how the telegraph, the phone, there was this wonderful piece that my dad likes to quote quite a lot. Who was it that said it again? A writer that I can't quite remember. It'll come to me in a moment who the writer is. But anyway, he was in a party in London at the turn of the 20th century, early 20th century, and this woman came up to him, Chesterton, came up to him and said, Mr. Chesterton, isn't it fantastic now with the new telephones, and that we can call anyone all over the world and we can speak to them at any time, and you know, there's no barriers anymore to having these kinds of conversations. And he said, yes, madam, he said, what shall we say? What shall we say? And so other technologies that are, you know, so for instance, penicillin, the development of penicillin, the development of motor car, that changed. So the motor car meant that suburbs started to appear in cities. That people could now live in the suburbs and drive in. It had huge, significant difference in terms of the growth of particular kind of urbanisation, particular kinds of social problems associated with that. The railroads. Another one that's often, again, some of the most insignificant ones, another one in the Western world that seems incredibly significant in terms of changing the world we live in today, is the contraceptive pill. You know, so this produced, was very instrumental in terms of women coming into the workforce and things like that. And so, and even kind of things like photocopiers, washing machines, these kinds of things, very mundane technologies, these things have very significant implications and were implicated in very far-reaching kinds of changes for many generations before. And so Bray says, look, you know, don't get caught up in this hype that the world today is changing faster than ever before. That, you know, and I think any historian, again, we talked about history before, I think any historian would be very careful about making such kind of claims. You know, you got to wait at least kind of a generation before you kind of do any kind of analysis, any kind of historical analysis of a particular period of time. But what Ray's saying here is that, look, the evidence for this is pretty much non-existent. And he gives the examples about globalization as well, and there's that wonderful Kirsten Thompson book on globalization, which he cites, which shows, you know, how widespread these kinds of population migrations and such were, and trading in the 19th century, the 18th century even. And so a lot of these kinds of things that we just assume, now we've got the internet, now we've got globalization, then, you know, suddenly the world has been turned on its head, you know. So here again, he says, look, but he says it doesn't really matter anyway at the end of the day whether the world is changing at a faster rate today than it ever has before. It doesn't really matter. What matters is what?
That we believe.
We believe it. And he says, so this is back to this notion of enactment, this enacted theory. Look, we believe we're operating in this crazy world, so we behave like crazies. Okay, we run around the place. We grab the solution. And so he says that this has a self-fulfilling element, and this is very much the kind of enacted theory that we were talking about before. It's that if we believe that we're dealing in this really hostile environment where everything's changing quickly and we struggle to keep up and so on, then we're going to enact the world in that particular way. And so basically what he's saying here is that we've created what he calls, and I think this metaphor is a really good metaphor, and this metaphor often as well resonates very well with people in executive classes and executive audiences. He says we've created this treadmill of change. We've created so what does that metaphor evoke for you? Treadmill of change.
Momentum.
Momentum. Yeah. Anything else? What else do you think about a treadmill? It's ongoing, it never stops. Yeah. It just keeps going. But you don't really get anywhere, do you? You keep running to stand still. You keep running to stand still. So in some sense there's this notion that we're here, we're caught in this trap where we're just running faster and faster and faster, and we're really getting nowhere. But if we stop running, we're going to be blown off the side, probably end up with a serious injury. So I think it captures something about the sense of necessity here, about the sense of and why do you think this is the case? I mean, why are we caught up in this kind of treadmill? Why are we caught up in this kind of treadmill of change?
Because we believe the discourse and we now need to keep up with the neighbours, everybody else is on.
Yeah. So,
you're either in the neighbour, you're not.
Okay, let me ask you a different thing then. Let me ask you, let's draw attention now. So politics has been a key aspect. Politics has been a key aspect of what we've been talking about in this module. What's the politics of this? What's the politics of this fetishization of change? What's the politics of the way in which this discourse is set up?
He identifies an elite and benefit from this discourse.
Yeah.
And that obviously maintaining the discourse is maintaining the elite.
Yeah. Okay. So who are these people? Who are these people that are who are the cheerleaders for this discourse? Who are the cheerleaders? Cheerleading is a good word. Who would you say is the main culprits for promoting this notion that the world has gone crazy, that it's changing ever faster? Unless we embrace these new techniques, unless we embrace these new technologies, we're history.
We promote it in ourselves, like we're constantly, you have the latest phone, you have the latest everything, and it's trying to keep up, because if you seem to have say for example, Nokia, one of the old brick phones now, you seem to be obsolete because you don't have access to your email or anything.
But who spends a lot of money making sure you feel that you're not a proper human being if you don't have the latest iPhone or something? Who spends a lot of money to make sure that you feel like that? Who configures you like that?